Who we are, who we were, and who we're destined to become are all reflections of the stories we tell, of gods and devils from tales of the heart to those of fear and foreboding. Stories shape us in the world we live in. Myths, folk tales, and even religious parables all define our cultures and beliefs. In each episode of Faith and Fear, we will dip our toes into the comparative narratives spanning the globe, considering the concepts and archetypes common to us all.
Enle shalom and prazir. Hello and peace. It's a pleasure. Thanks for following me down the rabbit hole once again in my journey to better understand the stories and beliefs that shape us. Horror is like a serpent, always shedding its skin, always changing, and it will always come back. Dario Argento. I'm back to bring you a lost interview just in time for Halloween. I talked to Mike Tritle, the author of Mr. Secrets, The Collins House, and host of the Warning Woods podcast, about the good, the bad, and the ugly of the horror genre. I wanted to discuss horror in general, and Miles was a great person to help me address such a topic, so I hope you'll enjoy. As always, your feedback is appreciated.
Today, I am excited to bring my first guest of the new year, a talented writer and storyteller whose work I've quickly become a fan of, and I'm sure you will too. So, I'd like you all to welcome Mike Tritle, the author of Mr. Secrets, The Collins House, and host of the Warning Woods podcast. He's
Thanks
joining
for
me.
having me.
I'm
sorry.
He's joining me today to discuss the nature of horror.
I'm excited to be here. Thank you for having me on.
Is there I'm not sure if I pronounced your last name the right way.
It's Tritle.
Okay.
I hear it both ways. I actually think people pronounce it Tritle more often than they pronounce it Tritle, but Tritle is the correct way.
Okay.
If there is such a thing.
I wanted to make sure I would ask. I told you before the podcast actually started that I have been listening to your podcast recently, and I've been listening to some of the many stories that you've written, and I'm enjoying them. You have some very frightening tales that short but sweet.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. Yeah, releasing a story every week does kind of limit the length to, kind of around 20-30 minutes is about the length they come out to. And I find that is kind of an interesting limitation, which is largely based around suspense. That's a pretty short period of time to build up a lot of tension and suspense. So that's a fun challenge.
Right. I think they work. And I mean, I love the way that you end them, because many of them end with like a cliffhanger. And I think that that's a very appropriate way, especially with some of the stories that I've listened to. I actually was glad that you ended them where they were, because it kind of leaves the audience kind of wondering what happened, and it kind of leaves you on the edge of your seat a little bit.
Yeah, I find that's a way to kind of make the story stick with people. It really sticks in their head when there's a cliffhanger or some kind of unanswered question that they can ponder as they, go out through the rest of their day or their week. And I find that's a way to just kind of engage the audience even more and bring them into the story. I get some YouTube comments from people who analyze the story, or they'll type out their whole idea of where they think the story went or what was actually going on. And I love having that sort of interaction with an audience in what would otherwise really just be a one-way format.
Right. And that makes a lot of sense. especially getting that feedback and knowing that people are actually taking the time to look into your stories and try to figure out what exactly you meant or what you were trying to say.
I love it. Yeah, I really do.
Previously, I've talked about fear. I'm not sure how much you've actually looked into my podcast, but usually I like to take just general concepts like fear and dig a little bit into them as much as I can to kind of just give an umbrella understanding.
Sure. Yeah, you and I kind of have that in common, I think, with our podcast. We do it in a very different way. But I will think about concepts and not necessarily how a certain culture would look at it, but maybe a type of person. As I develop a character, it's a question of how would they respond to this sort of fear? How would this person deal with fear? So I think you and I we're curious about that. Am I right about that?
Absolutely. Well, today I wanted to take a little bit of a different direction and gear the conversation towards horror specifically. And I figured you would be a great person to help me discuss this topic.
I'll do my best.
So, would you like to tell us a little about yourself?
Yeah, sure. So I've been doing the Warning Woods podcast for I think about a year and a half now. I always forget when I actually published the first episode. I've been writing it for about 2 years. And they're individual stories. Every week is a different story with new characters and everything. They're short stories. And that got started mostly just out of a need for a creative outlet that wasn't music. I've been a musician for 15 years or so, and that was my main hobby when I was in high school and college was making music, mainly the electric guitar. Then I had a child. When my daughter was born, playing the electric guitar at full volume at any time of the day wasn't an option anymore. She would be sleeping and things like that. So I needed to find a creative outlet that was quiet. And I had been interested in writing before. I'd done some short stories and things like that. So I decided to try my hand at writing. And that resulted in my first novel, The Collins House, which is actually based on it's loosely based on some events from my childhood. And then I just found that I loved that process of writing so much that I wanted to do it more often. So I started writing short stories, and that inevitably became the Warning Woods podcast. So now that's it's something that I do every week. I put out a story, and that's a good way for me to balance my time with that creative outlet of writing, along with my day job and being a father as well.
That makes a lot of sense to me. So what drew you to the horror genre specifically?
I've been a horror fan for a long time, and I think that's what it was. Just that's kind of where my interest was outside of music. I loved, I'm trying to think of what the first horror movies I saw was, but Paranormal Activity was big when I was pretty young. And I distinctly remember watching the first Paranormal Activity movie and just realizing that was something I was really interested in, was that tension and fear that something an hour and a half long could create and then leave you with for the following days. And so that's something I was always attracted to, is that lingering feeling that something in the horror genre can leave someone with. And then since the Collins House is based on some actual events, it was somewhat of a ghost story. That kind of just naturally led me into writing horror, and it just kind of took care of itself from there.
Nice. Do you have any favorite horror movies, books, or even TV shows?
Oh gosh. TV shows, the stuff that Mike Flanagan's been doing with Netflix, and I know he's going over to Prime Video now, but Haunting of Hill House and Haunting of Bly Manor. The book Haunting of Hill House is also, fantastic. If I were to pick, I think my favorite horror movie is probably The Witch, the Robert Eggers film. I just think it has so much of a creepy atmosphere. And, the first time I watched that movie, I actually didn't like it. It wasn't until I had some people tell me to watch it again, and just go into it not expecting the paranormal activity type of, you know, jump scares and that sort of thing. Just kind of just involve myself in the entire movie, and I loved it. I found that sort of low level of tension throughout the whole movie, and then build that with the atmosphere and how the plot just kind of built itself along. I love that. And if you listen to, you know, my podcast, The Warning Woods, I think you'll find a lot of influence in that sort of atmospheric horror that, you know, even just the soundscapes and stuff that I make. I try to implement that just dark atmosphere to help build some tension. And then, of course, you know, all the Stephen King stuff is great. You know, any movie that's based on his work is always, you know, in my experience at least, it's going to be pretty good. Pet Sematary, excellent movie and book. I'm always fascinated too by things like Cujo and Misery, where there's such a limited setting to those, both the books and the movies. Misery, just most of it taking place in this one little house, and Cujo taking place basically inside a car for the entirety of the book. I'm fascinated by how he can build an entire narrative off of those situations. So I'm rambling a bit, but those are some examples of, you know, some of my favorite things.
As a writer, I feel like Misery kind of holds a special place.
Absolutely, yeah.
So yeah, that's probably one of my favorite of Stephen King's books.
Yeah.
So going forward, I guess it would be pertinent to define horror. As a definition, horror is described as an intense feeling of fear, shock, or disgust. As a genre, it includes literature, television, movies, or any works of art that are intended to startle, shock, scare, and make audiences generally uncomfortable. Why do you think we continue to enjoy horror? What do you think draws us to it?
That's an interesting question. I've heard some people say that it's being able to kind of participate in that adrenaline spiked, kind of hyper alert situation from the comfort and safety of your own home. I'm a little bit cynical. I think that, you know, for some people it's really a matter of just how mundane their daily life is, how boring their own relationships are, and things like that, and it draws them to this hyper elevated level of excitement. And you know, whether that's, for some people, a Marvel movie is enough to do that. You know, they have kind of the superhero fantasies, and some people just want to see how, you know, dark and messed up the world can get. And I think it's different for everybody. You know, I have friends who are really drawn to the blood and gore side of horror. I love that definition of horror you read, by the way, because that really encompasses all of it. Because I tend to be drawn more towards things like, I don't know if you've seen The Menu, the movie that came out late last year.
I don't think so.
There's been all kinds of debate online about whether or not it's a horror movie, because it's not your traditional movie with the, you know, jump scares and blood and everything. It's really just this strange situation that these characters are kind of locked into. I think it's a horror movie because my feeling is that anything that gives you that, I guess, feeling of just dread, that intense fear, that to me is horror. And whatever it takes to get that, if that's seeing a lion at the zoo, I think that counts as horror. You know, if that gives you that intense level of fear.
It's definitely subjective, and I think that anything that makes you uncomfortable like that can be considered as horror.
I agree.
And for different people, that can mean different things.
Yeah, absolutely.
As a folklore and mythology enthusiast, I'm very interested in the role horror plays in such stories. Most know that fables are meant to teach people, especially children, a life lesson, but fairy tales and folklore were often intended to do the same thing, and albeit more often than not, far darker and gruesome manner. If any of my listeners aren't aware, the original version of many fairy tales that we know today were far less watered down. They were violent, bloody, and downright horrific. Look at Cinderella, Sleeping Beauty, and especially Little Red Riding Hood's origins. Sadistic characters carried out some of the most heinous acts, and no one was too innocent to be harmed. Life was hard, dangerous, even terrifying. Stories were meant to reflect this, even give a safe way to confront these truths. So how do you feel about fairy tales and folklore when it comes to the horror genre?
I think that's maybe the original influence. You know, those dark tales, Hansel and Gretel, things like that, old stories of witches and that sort of thing. It has a huge influence, I think. And that's something that, I'm fascinated by, is the way those types of really intense stories were used to educate children. Now we have a much softer way of teaching kids about, the dangers of the world and things. And the dangers of the world are very different than they were back in the Grimm's fairy tale days.
Absolutely.
But it's amazing to me how, in a world that could just very quickly end a child's life, they were very blunt in their storytelling. They really didn't cut around the corners. They didn't, beat around the bushes. They went right to the point, and, they made kids afraid of the woods for good reason, during that time.
Yeah, that was definitely intentional. And I think such stories were intended to scare the audience away from immoral and sinful behavior, sometimes to even encourage conformity,
Yeah.
which one could argue continues in the horror narratives of popular media today. I mean, look at the slasher genre. The movie Scream itself points out the many tropes that include teens who participate in inappropriate acts being the first victims of the movie villain.
Yep. Yeah, we definitely see that. And Scream straight up says it. But really, in most of those movies, the first death, or maybe, within the first three for sure, is going to be the promiscuous, hot young lady that's, acting out in ways that the rest of the cast either doesn't approve of, or that maybe they think the audience wouldn't approve of. And then also, in more recent things like that movie It Follows, I think is a great metaphor for STDs and things like that. If people haven't seen that movie, it's essentially a curse that is passed through having sex.
I know what you're talking about.
Yeah. And it's funny because the movie follows the character who has the curse, but if you flip it around and you think about the people that they're trying to sleep with in order to pass this on, they don't know that the character has this curse. So that could be seen as almost a warning to people, that
it's
you never
very
know.
analogous of an STD.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Definitely some of the movies you're thinking about, like Jason and even Freddy or any of those slasher films, really, you have, like you said, the teens that are fooling around or drinking or partying, anything like that. They're usually the first ones to end up being harmed.
Yeah, it's usually the party animal that goes down first.
So where do you see the horror genre going?
Man, I think we've kind of had the first AI-based horror movie with Megan. It just came out a few weeks ago. I think that we're going to see a lot of that, at least for a while. And it's going to be interesting what that'll mean, if that'll be technology-based horror. But generally speaking, overall, I think it's always going to come back to this same sort of pattern of playing on those base fears of being manipulated into, maybe manipulated is not the right word, but just experiencing things that make you uncomfortable, like you said. So whether that's through technology or the people around you, I think that is always going to exist, because no matter what technology we're using, no matter what our world looks like, I think those things are always going to be what make us uncomfortable, is feeling out of place, feeling threatened. And I don't know if there's a way that horror will ever get away from that entirely. It'll just change and evolve in the devices used to get that feeling.
Right. I think technology definitely plays a big role. I'm thinking of the Terminator movie. The very first movie and even the second one were definitely aimed at scaring the audience and kind of like warning them about the dangers of artificial intelligence and how that could go completely awry. And I feel like that's not just in the horror genre, that's also in the science fiction genre. And of course, those two can kind of like cross over here and there. So
Yeah.
I definitely think that technology is probably one of those very realistic horrors that, we can come and face anytime in the future, I guess. Even today, there's definitely technology that can be used the wrong way.
Sure. Yeah. And when social media was becoming more popular, there was a whole rash of social media based movies and things like that were based on that. There was actually a really good one called Host that came out during the pandemic that was all about Zoom. The whole thing takes place over Zoom. So I think people they'll use the technology more as a device, but the basics of horror, I think, will always remain the same. Those fundamentals will always be there.
Well, yeah, speaking about Zoom and social media, I mean, that's definitely one of those tools, one of those pieces of technology that can be weaponized. I mean, there's been multiple instances where people have, met someone online and taken advantage of them or victimized them in some way, shape, or form. So that's one of those things to be wary of. And I believe there's even been some instances where you've had actual serial killers who have used dating sites and just social media in general to kind of target their audience and even find out ways to get next to them.
Yeah, I'm sure. There's that show Catfish that's all about people, manipulating people, and it's always fun at the end. Not fun, but
Right.
for the audience, it's always fun at the end. There's that confrontation, but that could go so differently. If you think about if somebody had really bad intentions for somebody and they were able to trick them into meeting them, they weren't who they said they were. That's absolutely a horrible possibility.
And I'm sure it's probably happened at some point in time.
Yeah.
So do you think horror will ever fall out of public favor?
It's been around for a long time in one form or another. I think it's, there's, if you think even just to old campfire stories, old ghost stories, it's always been around. I don't know. I don't see it going away. I think it's too exciting for people.
I don't think it will either. I mean, of course, there's been instances where you have, I'm trying to think of the best way to put it. I don't want to say like the moral brigade, but you have certain audience that will blame violent acts or kids doing certain things on the media that they consume, whether it's movies or music. And I don't think that that's necessarily the case. I think that maybe people might get ideas from some of these things, but at the same time, I feel like more often than not, those that use movies or music to carry out violent acts probably already had it in them, and they just use that as a source of inspiration. So I definitely think that for most people, things like horror are a positive outlet. They're a way to deal with your fears, maybe even a way to deal with negative emotions that you're having. They're just a way to kind of a release valve of sorts, I guess you could say.
Yeah, I totally agree 100%. And what you said about, the people who use horror or even, just violent movies in general as an excuse for their behavior. I think those people have it in them already.
Absolutely.
Totally agree with that. And, honestly, if there is moral outrage, bring it on. I think, there's that old saying that like no press is bad press, or however it goes. I think moral outrage about something just gets more attention on it, and the people who are going to love it are just going to get more excited about it.
It really does.
I don't think that's a bad thing. I'm also I'm a metalhead too, and all the moral outrage about metal music only bolsters the real fans and brings more people in who never would have heard of it in the first place. So, if there's people that want to get upset about horror, bring them on.
I actually just had a conversation with a coworker about metal music, and I think the way that I put it was, the moral outrage toward certain music genres to me never really seemed right, because most people listen to music as like a release, and angry music might make you feel a little angry, but I think for most people that are really fans of those type of things, it's in more ways than one, it's a way for you to feel like you're not alone. Like you feel you're going through these emotions, and this music is a way for you to kind of confront the fact that other people are going through the same thing. Other people are feeling many of the same ways that you're feeling. And sometimes that can make you feel 10 times better just because, you're realizing you're not the only person that's feeling these things. And I just feel like, to me, that's a good thing.
Yeah. Yeah. Something to relate to is really important. I think a lot of the times, not to keep dwelling on people that want to do violent things, but you always hear about them being isolated. And, you can, even
Absolutely.
if you're isolated from the real people around you, having outlets like music or like movies and books and, things that you can relate to in that way, I think is a good way to avoid that isolation.
Sometimes they're coping mechanisms.
Yeah.
And I mean, to add on to your point earlier when we were talking about fairy tales and folklore and their origins, they were violent for a reason. They were literally meant to force their audience, especially children, to confront the dangers of the world. So I've heard it said before that the fact that we've watered down some of these stories is kind of counterproductive. They're not really fulfilling the purpose that they were created for. They're just this kind of fluffy entertainment when they were actually meant to kind of like help children confront the dangers of the world, in a safe manner.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I think there's some value lost in sanitizing these stories, and you get them out to a broader audience. People are more generally accepting of them, but they do lose the main purpose. They just become entertainment.
Absolutely. Well, do you have any other thoughts that you'd like to share regarding just horror, fear, writing, anything in general?
No, not much. I just tell people, I guess, if you're listening to this and you ever thought about writing, just do it, because that's what I did. I just opened my laptop because I needed something to do, just started writing, and then here I am still doing it and loving it. And whether or not I see any, financial success or a real career come out of it, I love doing it. Give it a shot.
I absolutely agree. And I think it's definitely one of the best outlets. You don't have to be a good writer to write. You don't have to be a good artist to draw. Just producing and putting yourself out there, putting yourself in your work, it has purpose. It has meaning. It's actually doing what it's supposed to do. And you don't even have to share it with anybody. Just, do it for your own gratification. And of course, there's the option to like put it out there, and it might get its own audience, and people might appreciate your work for exactly what it is.
I agree. And you're not going to get worse at it.
It's one of those things that you're only going to get better. You're going to learn from your experience.
Yep.
You're going to learn from your failure, and actually failure, contrary to what most people believe, is a good thing. That's one thing I don't think that we should be afraid of. I think it's easy to be afraid of, and it's hard to say, just get over your fear and just do the thing, because, a lot of people are self-conscious, but most people that confront those fears and just go ahead and do the thing, 9 out of 10 times don't regret it.
Yeah, I agree. I'd 100% agree with that.
So I feel like fear and horror, they have their purpose. You kind of have to know when to embrace them and when to overcome them.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah, definitely something that you want to keep in its rightful place. And, if you do find yourself relating a little too much to it, maybe, find yourself a good therapist.
Most definitely. Well, I think that's pretty much it. I think we've both covered much the crux of what I wanted to talk about. You were a great guest, and I think you had some very insightful outlook on some of the questions that I've asked you, and I appreciate you joining me tonight.
Well, I appreciate you having me on. This was a fun conversation. These are great questions, and you're great at prompting good conversation. So thank you.
Thank you. Do you have any links or social media sites you'd like to share?
Sure. Yeah. So my podcast, The Warning Woods, is on all major podcast platforms. It's on every platform I know of, including YouTube. You can find it on YouTube. On social media, I'm mainly active on Instagram at The Warning Woods, all one word. There's also a Facebook page you can find for The Warning Woods. And yeah, that pretty much covers it for my my online presence. So you can find me there.
Awesome. And I definitely suggest anybody who's interested in a horror genre to check out the Warning Woods podcast. It will definitely be worth your time. And as we've said already, the episodes aren't usually very long, so it's something you can listen to on your commute or, while you're doing things around the house. But
Absolutely.
you won't be sorry.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Well, Miles, I thank you for coming on tonight, and I appreciate you conversating with me today.
Thank you. It's mutual.
Thanks for listening to me as I've nerded out about stories and beliefs. Join me next week as I journey down the rabbit hole once again by subscribing and listening wherever podcasts are available. Leave me a comment on iTunes. 5-star reviews are always great and help others find the podcast. Also, you can email me at faithandfearpodcast@gmail.com. And lastly, share with others you feel may enjoy or get something out of these conversations. Who knows? Maybe then we'll be one step closer to glimpsing the true nature of faith and fear. Music courtesy of pixabay.com.